Shalom, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for our class, How Can Qohelet Quell the Curious Mind? An exploration of a new translation and commentaries on the strangest book of the Hebrew Bible. We are honored to be joined today by Rabbi Dr. Aubrey Glazer, and I would love to tell you a little bit more about today's guest speaker. Rav Aubrey L. Glazer, PhD from University of Toronto and rabbinic ordination from JTSA, is honored to serve as Department Chair of Jewish Thought and Philosophy for Aleph Ordination Program. Aubrey is founding director and editor-in-chief of Panui, a think tank devoted to researching, reflecting, and teaching modern and contemporary Jewish mysticism in a dynamic and authentic way to build conscious, compassionate community. Aubrey is currently honored to serve as senior rabbi of Beth Abraham Synagogue in Dayton, Ohio, and has served as senior rabbi in the following communities: Congregation Shaarei Zion, Montreal, Congregation Beth Shalom, San Francisco, as well as Jewish Community Center of Harrison, New York. Aubrey has served as a mentor for rabbinic students from diverse seminaries. As a graduate of the Institute for Jewish Spirituality, Aubrey co-led Jewish meditation retreats at Makor Or with Zoketsu Norman Fisher, as well as teaching Zohar in the Philosophy Circle of Lehrhaus under the direction of Daniel C. Matt. Aubrey has completed certification of Kashrut Rav HaMachshir and Jewish Business Leadership. Aubrey's recent publications on contemporary philosophy and theology include Mystical Vertigo, Tangle of Matter and Ghost, Leonard Cohen's post-secular songbook of mysticism, Jewish and Beyond, and God Knows Everything is Broken, Bob Dylan's Gnostic Mystical Songbook. Aubrey is co-editor and translator of a multi-volume series on Tiberian Hasidism called From Tiberias with Love. Rabbi Glazer, thank you so much for being here today.
The person or the process that we all need to go to in terms of trying to understand the meaning and the direction and the purpose of our lives, I want to argue and to share with you and to discover together is Qohelet. So what is Qohelet? Who is Qohelet? How does it work? We're going to look at four distinct sections that are excerpted from the new translation of Qohelet that I was honored to midwife into the world with my chavruta, my study partner and colleague, Rabbi Martin Cohen, whose mellifluous translation we're going to be looking at, as well as two layers of commentary that are part of a dialogue. And I imagined, as I do in the book, that these are curious conversations over coffee with Qohelet. So if you had a chance to sit down with Qohelet and have coffee with him or her, and I'll explain why I say that in a moment, because it's actually somewhat ambiguous, the gender of Qohelet, if it's a person or if it's a process. But let's take a look in and just see, maybe show of hands or emojis, how many people have actually read through the entirety of the 8 chapters of Qohelet before? Show of hands, emojis, okay. And of those whose hands are up, how many of you left more confused or more clarified than when you entered into that curious conversation? Did you find that there was a certain quality of clarity that emerged for you in the process of reading Qohelet, or did you leave with let's see, clarity, thumbs up for clarity. All right, so it looks like thumbs up for confusion or lack of clarity. What I want to do is to go through, as I mentioned, 4 excerpts of just given the time that we have together. And I want to share with you a verse, a translation, and then the dialogical commentary, because this has emerged out of a chavrusa, out of a dyadic study relationship that really, in many ways, exemplifies the great work that's going on in Bali Beit Midrash as well, that comes from the house of study. Marty and I were in conversation about this text. I want you to see and to partake in this conversation. So we're going to look at a verse, we're going to look at his translation, and then we're going to look at Marty's first layer of commentary, which sort of functions like Rashi, right? Remember the great scholars of Parshanut, like Nachman Leibowitz, would always ask, if you want to know what's going on in a verse, the first thing that Nachman Leibowitz would ask is, what's bothering Rashi? So we're going to ask ourselves, what's bothering Marty in the first layer of commentary, which is called Kol ha-Tor, and then come back for another round of conversation to look at my commentary, which is called Ruah, ha-Orev. And as we go through it, we'll try to figure out what's bothering us in relationship to and in conversation with Qohelet, And then I want to take a few minutes after each of these for us to take a breath, to absorb what's being shared, and then to react for a few moments together to see if there might be some further clarity that emerges in terms of the direction of our lives. Because as I'm going to suggest a number of times together, Qohelet I actually don't think is a person, but a process. But with that in mind, let's see what happens when we start by the premise that the Megillah begins with, remember, which is read on the holiday of Sukkot. But I think it's something we should be reading every day of our lives. So I welcome you into this journey, and I ask you to hold questions. You can put them in the chat if something comes up while we're going through it. But let's hold the questions until we go through the first 3 layers of each of these conversations, and then we'll take questions at the end of each of these excerpts. So the premise of the Megillah and this experiment starts as follows: that life is as insubstantial as a single breath. Qohelet begins chapter 1, verse 1 and 2. Divrei Qohelet ben David, melech Yerushalayim. Hevel havalim amar Qohelet, hevel havalim, hakol havel. These are the words of Qohelet, ben David, king in Jerusalem. The merest of breaths, said Qohelet, the merest of breaths. Everything is as insubstantial as a single breath. And this is the key to the entire Megillah. Let's take a look now and see in Quell ha-Tor. My chavritza Marty opens with this following framing. Moderns can begin to contemplate the author king's treatise by asking themselves, where do they stand on these matters? Can the sadness inherent in the human existence be dissolved in the pursuit of knowledge? Does the tension between absolute inalterability of nature and the appearance of nature to be in constant state of flux depress us or inspire us? Does the brevity of life, hevel havalim, make human endeavor noble or insipid, pointless or supremely meaningful? Does Qohelet's contention that nothing exists more really than a deep breath lead to the conclusion that all effort is almost by definition inane, and that only a slothful life devoid of strenuous effort to do anything at all will make any real sense for those lucky few possessed of true knowledge about the nature of things? These are the questions that Qohelet is laying out for us at our feet as we open the book, which is in the form of a Megillah, in the section of the Tanakh called Ketuvim, and we begin the process of reading. So we would call these grounding questions. We don't answer them, we just reflect on them, and we notice, even in the way that the questions are laid out, there's a tension, right, between one point and the other point, which we would sometimes in philosophy call a dialectic. There is a thesis, there is an antithesis, but there is no synthesis. There are just opposing points of view, and now we're going to open up into the conversation and into this experiment of looking at life for meaning. And so now, in response to my chavruta Marty, I continue the conversation with him, and I respond to Marty by asking, are you one of those who blends in with the crowd, indistinguishable from the assembled? Or are you an individual who has the capacity to stand out, to winnow out the wisdom of experience and to assemble it, that's the key word, to assemble it into some coherent whole? These are the challenges before Qohelet, the one who aspires to not merely be the one of those assembled and anonymous, but to be an assembler, a convener. That's why I'm suggesting it may not be a person, but a process, because the Hebrew word Qohelet, literally in its feminine form, means the one who is assembling, the one who is convening. What does it mean to be an assembler, really? Does the author merely want to bring people together like we're doing now at VBM, right? We could say that Alex and Reb Shmuley are the Qohelet in this moment because they are bringing us and assembling us all together. That would mean it's a process, not a person. Or is Qohelet seeking to gather wisdom in the manner of a singular teacher looking to learn from students as well as to teach them? Or does Qohelet see him or herself as a kind of a goad, as a gadfly, as one whose purpose is to serve as a transformative beacon of wisdom, an assembler of wise thoughts, who wishes to awaken those who slumber away to deeper awareness of themselves and their world. So that's the opening way of setting the table, laying the Megillah at our feet. Let's take a few minutes, just breathe in our Merest Breath, our Hevel Havalim. And as we go through this process, I think one of the things, before we go on to the next section, Alex will get ready for us. Let's open it up to the gallery for a moment and just see if there's anything that you notice coming either for the first time or for the 1500th time back to Qohelet, anything that emerges in terms of what's the curious conversation that is emerging around Qohelet this time. Anything that you notice, or a question, a curiosity. One of the things about Qohelet is always to be curious in the nature of the conversation that we enter into together. So I see Bev has a hand up.
Thank you. Two things that come up for me, and I'm only new to this, is the first book on Kabbalah that I got, not even knowing it was about Kabbalah, was God as a Verb. And when I hear you speak of this feminine energy, like the Shekinah, I think, oh, well, that relates to the spiritual. So that's what it means for me. And when you spoke of gadfly, it reminds me of the indigenous trickster. And my way of looking at things is it doesn't matter what tradition, the truth is the truth, and it's going to come through in different ways that we can understand. So I find this quite amazing and lovely, and thank you.
Well, those are some wonderful observations. The verb, or at least the gerund form of Qohelet, does raise the question of the feminine, not in terms of a God presence, which is a different, equally interesting conversation, but more as a source of wisdom. However, you are onto something. You're intuiting something very interesting, which is, again, part of a larger conversation we might have another time. But scholars of the Bible, like Tikva Frymer-Kensky of blessed memory, wrote a very important book called In the Wake of the Goddesses, and she talks about the earliest presences of the divine creative force within the context of the Hebrew Bible. And if you go back and look, for example, at Proverbs, or in sections of Psalms, or in Job, it was clear that Chokhmah, which we're getting into because we are looking for wisdom, right? That's part of the quest of Qohelet, right? As Job also asks in another parallel section of the book of Ketuvim, these are all wisdom texts. Chokhmah, ma'ayin timatzeh, wisdom, where can she be found? Chokhmah is also feminine. And if you look at those sections in Proverbs where it speaks of the creation of the world, God turns to Chokhmah as a co-creative partner to create the world through wisdom. And so that's a voice that echoes and shimmers through this text. And I don't think it's a mistake that both Chokhmah and Qohelet are declined in the feminine. It's part of the wisdom tradition that we're trying to recover. So, and yes to the trickster observation, and also yes to the possibility that there is a universal wisdom that comes through the Hebrew sage that's meant to speak to all of us. Notice as we go through these excerpts, and also as you reread, I hope you'll continue to reread Qohelet, there's nothing that is intrinsically particularistic about this wisdom. This is human wisdom. This is a guidance for what it means to live a life and to be human and to follow the path of Chokhmah. And that's something that is also fascinating for us to think about. So thank you, Bev. Mona, great to see you.
Good to see you too. It's interesting because, Qohelet is often read very pessimistically. We could read the Merest of Breaths as a wisdom tradition in terms of focusing on the moment, and I think you'll probably get more into some of that. But the contrast with its, it's all evanescent, is the notion, which I really like, and I'd never thought of before, about Qohelet as an assembler. So we're assembling people, we're assembling ideas, we're assembling possibilities. That's a very different energy, much more positive than sort of it's all useless and what's the point?
I appreciate the acknowledgement and the openness to that energy, and it is a shift. And one of the things we have to acknowledge is also the challenge of translating the power of the Hebrew poetics into English, right? We are in the shadow of the King James version of translation, and in that spirit, vanity of vanities, futility of futilities is the way that Hebel Habelim has always been translated, and that sets a very pessimistic, nihilistic tone. I am trying, along with Marty, to suggest is another way of reconnecting to this wisdom path, which is not meant to be only, even if we do argue that it is pessimistic, or I would say cynical. I think cynical might be more of a constructive term, or skeptical, right? Harold Fish made that argument that Qohelet was one of the first Hebrew ironists, and as an ironist borders on cynicism. But as I mentioned to open the conversation, it's actually cynicism that is paired with simcha, right? When do we actually recite this Megillah? The sages were clear that we're not meant to be a people that are completely cynical, completely skeptical. We read this during the holiday, which is also known as Zman Simchatenu, right? This is a time for the search for simcha. And Qohelet asked the question about 8 times in the Megillah, what is simcha? Where can I find it, and how long does it last? What is the nature of joy and pleasure? And as you said, is this something that is evanescent, or is it something that is lasting? And so just appreciating your acknowledgement of that, Mona. It is a different energy, and that's very intentional. And again, pay attention to the way that we feel when we look at this this process of assembling wisdom together in a way that is not limited to just being cynical, but even if it's cynical and if it's somewhat skeptical, there is something else that is going on in the process and in the framing together. So thank you. Let's turn to Bob.
Interested in this whole question of wisdom as a universal. And I mean, the passages in Proverbs that talk about Chokhmah, also there's nothing sort of specifically Israelite about, Lady Wisdom's speech. I mean, she talks about taking delight in human beings. Mm-hmm. So is this kind of universality, is this sort of inherent in the wisdom tradition? Or, is it just something that crops up here and there?
It's a great question, and I can only give you a partial answer because Marty and I are now moving on to the next of the Megillah, which will be Proverbs. So we're going to do a deep dive into Proverbs and see if our theory holds, but our intuition is yes, and yes, and yes. Whether it's the book of Job, right, whose character basically is, as the Cohen brothers called him, a serious man, right? Job is every man, every person, and meant to be coming from the land of Uts, not just the place where pretzels are made, but really a place that is outside Israelite territory and tribal distinction, to say these are texts that ask the question, and Qohelet in particular, what does it mean to be human, and what does it mean to live a life that is guided by wisdom? So our contention is these are meant to be as universal as possible in terms of the breadth and the scope of the search for Chokhmah, but to also suggest that within the Israelite tribe, we are carriers of that wisdom tradition. But as was mentioned by Bev, every tribal tradition has their pearls of wisdom that they collect and that they transmit, and this is our process of collecting and sharing that wisdom. So let's take a look at the next one, and I want to ask others who are gathered around in this assembly to feel free to join in and to share some reflections and feelings as well. And given the mission statement of VBM, I thought this was an important one to look at as well in terms of social justice, because if we also assume, as Mona suggested, that Qohelet is sometimes misappropriated or at least mispresented as being a cynic, then cynics also seem to look at the world from a very passive perspective. And this is also another one of the ways of challenging ourselves to look at how the question of justice emerges within the world, and what does it mean to live in a world that is apparently enveloped in justice. And that's a big question that many of the wisdom texts are asking, not just Qohelet, but also Job and some of the others in Ketuvim. But let's take a look here and see. We're now on to chapter 2. This is verse 24. Ein tov b'adam she'ochal v'shata v'hera et nafsho tov be'amalo gam zo ra'iti ani ki miyad ha'elohim hi ki mi yochal u'mi yachush chutz mimeni ki la'adam she'tov lefanav natan chochma v'da'at v'simcha ולחוטא נתן עניין לאסוף ולכנוס, לתת לטוב לפני האלוהים, גם זה הבל ורעות רוח. I made some stress there on a few things that I wanted us to notice. First, the name of God that's used, as well as Chochmah, Da'at, and Simcha. Let's take a look and see what that translates as. 2:24, and so in the end I concluded there is no greater good for an individual than to eat and to drink and to endeavor to find some pleasure in this world, and even that, at least most of the time, is an unearned gift from God. The merest of breaths, said Qohelet, the merest of breaths, everything is insubstantial as a single breath. But God is not uninvolved in all this. To the individual who acts nobly and well, God gives wisdom, understanding, and pleasure. To the sinner, God gives the unquenchable desire for riches and property, which wealth the sinner ends up passing along to whomever God earns God's favor. And this too is mere breath and pursuit of the wind. So, what does Marty have to say about this section? In the end, moderns using the second chapter of Qohelet as a ruminative focus for purposeful meditative effort will succeed by best asking themselves the very question that, albeit mostly unasked, lurks behind all the author's musing. If life is nothing more than a long or short journey from cradle to grave, and if none can take money or learning along when it's all over anyway, then what exactly is the point of doing anything at all? Right? This becomes the ultimate question of the cynic. If we're all on our way from cradle to grave and we take nothing with us, then what is the purpose of life? Extremely cynical, as it appears to be, at least in the second chapter. Ruah ha-Orev, when I respond to Marty, how truly good it is to be able to eat when hungry and to drink when thirsty and appreciate all that comes your way to satiety. Peeking through the lattice work to see the hand of God at work may be surprising for a skeptical empiricist. This is what I call Qohelet, a skeptical empiricist. I'll explain at the moment, like Qohelet. But atheism, which we would expect from Qohelet if he was truly or she was this cynical, atheism is not an option because Elohim appears now already in the second chapter. Notice throughout this strange book of the Bible that God is addressed by Qohelet using the very generic and universal term for divinity in Hebrew, Elohim, and not with the formal tetragram or four-letter tribal name of God known as the Yud and the Hey and the Vav and the Hey that is revealed to Moses, the burning bush. Qohelet trusts that there is an ultimate calculus of why the righteous suffer while the evil prospers, and even if for the time being it remains an inscrutable mystery. In the truth of time, justice will be served, and the waiting within Elohim is a yearning for just deserts, all to be paid out in due time. So let's come back together. We'll just take a breath of the Hevel Havalim that we shared here, and notice a few of the things now that have emerged in the second chapter. As I mentioned, we now encounter the quest for Chochmah as being stated. We're introduced to a relationship with Elohim as a divine power that permeates the universe in a universal and general way rather than a specific and tribal way, which again, Bob, goes to your question about whether this is universal or particularistic in terms of it's the lens that it's using. And one of the ways that we can often find that is by looking at the name of God that's used by the author. And then the larger question of being mindful for even the unearned gifts that we have, like being able to eat and to drink, and to think about the ways that the Hebrew Bible suggests that we should look at the bounty that we receive and our abundance as being part of a much larger calculus, right? If we look at the second paragraph of the Shema, there is an understanding in that kind of biblical theology in Deuteronomy that if you're a good person and you do good deeds, then what happens? You'll be rewarded in due time. And if you are evil, you will be punished in due time, right? The rain will fall in its due season, or there will be famine. And so there is an understanding within the biblical theological mindset of the book of Deuteronomy that the wisdom books are reacting to, of something that is different in terms of its calculus. Qohelet sees Tzaddik Veralo Rasha V'Tov. How is it possible to live in a world that doesn't operate like the book of Deuteronomy? That actually, that I am a righteous person and I suffer, or there are evil people that prosper. That calculus is a major radical challenge to the theological landscape that happens and is addressed in each and every one of the books of Ketuvim. And that challenge that every religion has to face is known by the very fancy word of theodicy, right? Why is it that if I'm righteous, that I suffer? What is the meaning of my suffering? And when will justice emerge in a world that seems to be so profoundly unjust? These are the major challenges that every world religion has to contemplate. And if biblical monotheism is going to be something that is worth its weight on the search for wisdom, it has to provide some kind of guidance. That's part of the chokhmah that Qohelet is interested in exploring. So thoughts and reactions from other folks around the Qohelet chain that we are creating here. Are there others that want to share? I'm going to turn to Bev in a moment, but others that want to share anything that you're noticing that's emerging in reading the text in this way together? Any curiosities that emerge or questions? Okay, so let me turn to, there's a cat over here. Who's the cat? That's Lauren. Okay, we'll first turn to Lauren, AKA as a cat. Okay.
A Canadian cat.
Okay.
She's in Toronto.
Right.
It's interesting because it just popped in my mind just reading, to enjoy, eat, drink. I mean, it's hedonistic, but it's also like returning to Gan Eden, right? Because the first man, Adam Harishon and Chava, were basically told, this is here for you, just enjoy it. And this is before human beings went on to gain wisdom and the rest. But it's a very simple view. So if our idea is to return to Gan Eden, however you believe that, if it's after death or if we, through Tikkun Olam, maybe Mashiach's time will be Gan Eden, then this could be a description of it. Just a thought. It's just something that popped in my mind.
I think it's very interesting to notice how we read the Hebrew Bible. And generally, the way it's presented to us is as the acronym of Tanakh, right? Which means that if you're going to read this book, then you should start with the book of Genesis, go through the Torah, the Pentateuch, then go through the prophets, the Nevi'im, and then eventually someday when we graduate, we'll get to Ketuvim, right? But the truth is that what would happen if we started, and this is an experiment that I've been challenging myself to do, what happens if we were to come back with the beginner's mind and to look at the Tanakh again, but to start from Ketuvim and to look at the entire landscape of the Tanakh through the lens of Qohelet, right? And so these questions that you're bringing up, which really are the purpose, the direction, and the meaning of life, and you've raised a lot of very interesting and provocative things that Qohelet does deal with, both implicitly and explicitly. That is in terms of, is there an afterlife? And I'll get back to that question in a moment in Qohelet. But asking the question, what is it like to be a human being before there was Abraham and Sarah, and before there was Judaism, and before there were all these covenantal agreements that led to this relationship and this expectation of our relationship with God and the world? there was the human being that was trying to just learn how to be human before our eyes were opened. And once our eyes were opened in the garden, that's when, what tree was it said that we read that we were eating from? I said that we read from, but we also were eating from. It was the tree, Eitz Hadat Tov V'Ra, right? It was the tree of knowledge that allowed there to be a binary distinction, a dialectic between good and evil, right? To be able to create categories. And that was knowledge. But was that chokhmah? The mystics in our tradition have a lot of different views on that. But when we go back to the ancient wisdom of Qohelet, it's clear that there is another tree, another way that is the way of chokhmah, that asks us to go back to that moment before we ate from that particular tree, and to say there is the ability to have da'at, which Qohelet talks about in the second chapter already, right? Chokhmah, da'at, v'simcha. But there is something called chokhmah, which seems to be coming from a different tree. It's a different way of looking at the world, and it's not necessarily about categories that lead us into these binary quandaries. So it's a different way of thinking and processing the world. And I wanted to say one more thing, and then let me turn to Robin and Bev, because you raised a lot of issues, Lauren, that I'm not going to be able to answer, but I'm just going to lay it out, which is part of the reason why I remain curious after all these years about Qohelet, is that on the surface of it, on its own terms, the Hebrew Bible does not know of an afterlife. Okay, I'll say that again. On its own terms, the Hebrew Bible, and we can argue, and I'm sure you have these conversations with your millennial friends who are evangelical Christians and others who say, no, the book of Ezekiel, the book of Daniel, there's all these hints at proof for the afterlife. On its own terms, biblical scholars tend to agree that there is no clear vision of an afterlife, and this is all there is. So if this is all there is, then the questions for the meaning and the direction and the purpose of life, especially how do I process suffering and live a life of meaning and of compassion and of caring, when I realize that I don't have my just desserts in the time that is allotted to me, it raises these major existential questions that I'm left with. And Qohelet seems to, except really in the later chapters, make points to the possibility that there may be something more, right? V'yashov ha'aretz el, v'yashov ha'ruach el ha'aretz k'shehaya v'ruach teshuv el ha'elohim asher natana. I think it's in chapter 8, if I'm not mistaken, verse 10, that it says the dust returns to the earth, but the ruach returns to Elohim who gave it. So that's very ambiguous as to what that really means. But Qohelet is saying, I feel like there's something more. All I can do is point to it, but I can't show you where the Ruach is going. But I know that I hope that there's something more, because otherwise, most of life feels like it's nasty, brutish, and short, as the Hebrew cynic might say. So that's the way that things are on the surface. The reason why this commentary that I am sharing with you, and excited that you'll hopefully explore more on your own, in my commentary specifically, I went through the entire book of the Zohar, the great Jewish mystical medieval commentary on works of the Bible. And I checked every single reference to Qohelet, and I was shocked to discover that the major mystical commentary on the Hebrew Bible reads Qohelet as articulating an explicit view of the afterlife, and specifically in that verse that I shared with you, that the spirit returns unto God who gave it, and to Elohim who gave it. That is a proof for reincarnation of souls. That's not in the pshat of the text. That doesn't actually appear in the black fire of Qohelet, but within the white fire, the mystics say, well, of course it's there. Of course there's reincarnation. Of course there's an afterlife. Of course there's resurrection. All these things are there in the world of wisdom. You just have to know how to read the text. So I made a conscious effort to rally against my inherited empirical skepticism that I've inherited from Qohelet, and to say, Qohelet, you are truly a process of wisdom, which means that the biblical view of Qohelet and beyond into the Zohar suggests that all of this is part of the unfolding process of wisdom making, which includes an afterlife. So that was a remarkably surprising discovery that that really continues to keep me curious, and I hope it'll keep you curious about Qohelet in the commentary on Merest Breath as well. So let me turn to briefly to Robin and to Bev, and then we'll go on to maybe one or two more excerpts together.
So hello, I'm really enjoying this. So I have some thoughts, and they're just kind of random thoughts, so I'll share them and see where they land. And one of the thoughts that first came up was, and we know the story of the engraving on the ring that says, "This too shall pass," so going back, and I try and keep that in mind a lot, to keep myself in the present moment, which also brings to the other thought where I have a daughter, and when she was younger in her teenage high school years, was essentially having an existential crisis, fighting, hormones, teenager depression, and, saying, what's the purpose of life? Mm-hmm. And that's a really hard one when, and I really try to stress with her, it's like, there doesn't have to be a purpose. And, maybe the purpose is just to, like someone else was saying, was to enjoy, the way things are. And I don't know, it just seems like trying to say that there has to be a purpose puts a lot of almost undue pressure on people trying to find it. And what if they don't find it? And instead to just don't worry if there's an actual purpose, and just choose to do good things anyways, regardless if there's a purpose. Anyways, those are my rambling thoughts.
I wonder whether how many of us have been in the place where your daughter has been, where we have that moment of the existential crisis, looking for the meaning of life. And then a wise parent comes and says, well, maybe you just have to be in the moment, go with the flow and enjoy what there is, and really, see the blessing that is this unearned gift from God, and to know that it comes from a larger caring force in the universe that we call Elohim. Will that give us the satisfaction to go forward? And Qohelet is struggling with it. And it's interesting, you raised the image of that ring that is ascribed, an inscribed ring that says Gamze Ya'avor. According to the rabbinic imagination, King Solomon had that ring, and that was part of, remember, King Solomon, as we opened with chapter 1, verse 1, is ascribed as the author of Qohelet. So this now becomes one of the personae. There's many personae. Qohelet seems to wear, don, and discard many masks. But if it is written by King Solomon, that means this is the archetype of Hebrew wisdom, right? The wisest of the wise was Qohelet. And we see that from the way that Qohelet emerges in other books of the Bible. This was the sign of true wisdom. So if you want to be wise, you need to understand many things. You need to also listen to the wisest of feminine wisdom that came from his relationship with Queen Sheba and all the other feminine powers that surrounded him. He also knew how to listen to the animals. He knew where wisdom was everywhere in the universe. And part of the experiment of Qohelet is to give us some strategies for cultivating Chokhmah. And I think what I'll do, Alex, is as the last piece I want to look at is number 8 that we're going to turn to. But let me first, because I want to give you a strategy for cultivating this process, this practice of Chokhmah. So let's go turn briefly to Susanna and to Bev, and then we'll look at the excerpt from chapter 8.
I once heard somebody reframe that question of what is the purpose of life as what is he said, it's not for us to find out or determine what is the mystery of life, but just to live the mystery of life.
To live the mystery of life, right? And that really requires us to be extremely present to all the things that emerge and to be sensitized and deeply aware. And that's part of what Qohelet is doing through these chapters, is training us to use those, what we'll call skillful means, to form of Chokhmah that we're going to look at, Alex, in the day 8 excerpt in a moment. So Bev, thank you.
Yes. I wanted to say that when you were reading the English and there's certain words in there, I was triggered. So I'm still not calm because the second thing that happens after I get triggered is, oh, you shouldn't be saying this. You should keep your mouth shut. So with that in mind, the words like evil and sinner, I'm just, because I don't know how this was originally written, if it was in Hebrew or Aramaic, because I know in the Aramaic, those are not the words. You're unripe, you're off the path, and everybody is beautiful. There's no, your actions might be bad, but you as a human being and your human parts are not bad. So that always triggers me. And then I wonder, is this real? Are the words real? Or was it like when I took Near Eastern literature in the 60s? Is this written by one of the 5 groups and this was their interpretation because of where they were at and, you know, wanting to have power over people through the words? So for me, this unearned gift to me is so rich, because I think this is the way Indigenous people in their culture see the earth and our connection to it. So they don't hoard things. And I believe the tribes of Israel, of people in Judea at that time, didn't hoard either. They were nomadic. You couldn't. Gifts were given and you were thankful at the time for what you received. And, you know, the next month you could starve to death, but that wasn't the point. You never felt this need to acquire. And
let me unpack. You're sharing a lot. It's very thoughtful, and I want to be conscious of what you're sharing and also of time. So
thank you.
The text is written in Hebrew. There are those that have argued that some of the fragments were found in the places where it says meaning of the Hebrew uncertain in JPS. Suggest that maybe there were some corollaries in Aramaic, but essentially it's a Hebrew text. And a lot of the words that are used are familiar, and many of the expressions are unfamiliar. And what words like Ra and Ra'ut Ruach are speaking about evil that exists within the world, right? That we know that when someone suffers for causes that we understand, and especially that we don't understand, there is an awareness that evil exists in the world when people suffer. And that comes up again and again, and Qohelet laments that. Why is it necessary for there to be suffering? And also, is there any permanence to the pleasure that comes from all these material things that I have at my fingertips, right? If you go through the rest of the chapters, Qohelet will say, I have orchards, and I have gold, and I have silver, and I have everything that I need, and I've tasted all of the hedonistic pleasures that any human being could possibly ever desire. And I know that this pleasure doesn't last. I'm looking for something that's more lasting and more permanent. So Qohelet is on that quest. And also on that note, I think there's an abiding hope in Qohelet that even if evil does blow in and out of the world, that it's not something that necessarily is permanent, but it is something that tends to challenge the goodness, the greater good that Qohelet is looking to cultivate and that we're looking to cultivate within the world. There is an assumption, as Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi will later make centuries later in the rabbinic project of the Mishnah, of the question that Qohelet is asking much earlier on. It's the same question. Ezohi derech hayashara she'yabor bo ha'adam. What is the righteous path? What is the right path? What is the path of goodness that a human being should walk upon in order to live a meaningful life? That's the perennial question that is asked within Pirkei Avot. Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi asked the question, but here earlier, much earlier on, maybe between the 4th and the 6th century BCE, Qohelet is asking us to consider that question, to contemplate it. So with that in mind, let's look at the last excerpt together, and then we'll come back for some more questions and reflections, which is always appreciated. And I want to look at skill and wisdom. This now comes actually from chapter 10, verse 10. And as an example of what I will call cultural incommensurability. And I'll explain what that means in a moment, unless there are lumberjacks that are here, and then it'll be less culturally incommensurable. So you'll see what I mean in a moment, especially if you like Monty Python. Okay. Im kehe habarzel vehu lo fanim kilkel v'chayalim yagaber Vitron hachsher chokhmah. Speaking of the lumberjack, this too is how things are. If the blade of a dull axe is left unwhetted, then the lumberjack must use more strength to wield it usefully. From this we learn a truth. Skill is the context in which wisdom becomes detectable. I'll say that again. Skill is the context in which wisdom becomes detectable. Hachsher chokhmah. So now let's take a look and see Marty and Aubrey. Most stringent of all is the king's intimation that wisdom is not acquired through even the most intense educative experience. Doesn't matter how many PhDs or how many grad school courses you've been through, but through the kind of ruminative, principled, and deeply perceptive analysis of the world that is available to all who live in the world, as we were saying, who are present to everything that emerges within the experience of being in the world, with their eyes open and with their perceptive capabilities fully functional, and specifically not paralyzed or disabled by prejudicial, self-serving presuppositions about biases about the nature of things. To be truly present in the world and to experience everything in the flow of it all without the prejudicial, self-serving presuppositions about the way things are supposed to be. Think about how relevant that is and how challenging that is, especially in the times in which we find ourselves. Skill. Ruah ha-Orev says skill. Hechsher chokhmah is the context in which wisdom becomes detectable. Namely, that the advantage of skillful means depends upon the prudent exercise of one's wisdom. This is a crucial point of why this is a form of wisdom that may be universal, but is also somewhat particularly flavored by the Hebrew wisdom tradition, because this form of skillful means requires an exercise of one's wisdom, which means chokhmah, hechsher chokhmah, is applied wisdom, exercising forethought in one's action, even with the mundane chores, enables one to do a little that achieves a lot. The application of chokhmah reminds us of its broad range of meanings beyond what we can capture in English when we translate chokhmah merely as wisdom. Remember this now. And this is, again, part of the purpose of the entire journey of the book, of the Megillah of Qohelet. Chokhmah incorporates knowledge, reasoning powers, crafts, and expertise of all sorts that are applied. It's both the knowledge gained by learning and the intellectual powers that can analyze and evaluate and also apply that learning to living a meaningful life. And here, I think it's very important. I'm sure that many of you picked up on this in terms of the resonance of the English. It's worthwhile to compare the Hebrew way of thinking with the Buddhist way of thinking through the Sanskrit equivalent of upaya, which refers to expedient means, or an aspect of guidance along the paths to liberation where a conscious or voluntary action is driven by an incomplete reasoning about its direction. So, for example, upaya shala then comes to mean skill in means or skillful means. The reason that this nuance in translation matters that I'm offering here is that as unique as both wisdom traditions may be in their cultural context, Hebrew and Sanskrit respectively, both appear to be struggling with the challenge of how to teach skills effectively, especially when others are necessarily listening. What does it mean to be an effective teacher of applied wisdom? The teachers that are here on this Qohelet room together, as well as the students, understand this is a burning question for all of us. Qohelet and Buddha each realize that even if the student becomes a sage and eventually possesses a modicum of wisdom, still, when you desire sharing that hard-earned wisdom with eager students, it's no simple task. And skill, ultimately, not just of the teacher, but also of the student, is the context in which that wisdom becomes detectable. So it can be present in the space and the process of the Qohelet experience of convening and gathering and assembling like we are here, through the Zoom room of VBM. But the real challenge comes when the rubber hits the road. How do we apply this chokhmah to our own individual lives? That ultimately becomes the question of whether the context of our lives reflects the skill in which wisdom becomes detectable. So I'm sharing a lot here with you, but I wanted to leave you with another look at that same word that we started with, which we could reflect on for many hours together. And it is worthy of further contemplation and reflection. What is the purpose and the application of chokhmah for us in our life's journey? And how does the application of chokhmah allow us to live meaningful lives and to navigate those challenges that we all face, right? And when someone, when that voice inside of ourselves is having an existential crisis, what is the value and the good that chokhmah can provide us with when we face those challenges? These are the kinds of questions in terms of the application of wisdom in our lives that Qohelet is curious about. And I hope that you are becoming or have already been quite curious about, that we can now maybe take the last few minutes to absorb as the Hevel Havalim, the Merest Breath that courses through the universe and informs how we live in this moment. So any other curiosities, questions, observations from others that haven't had a chance to share yet? I'm open to hearing from you. I think I see Erwin has, it's a clap or it's a hand, and then Aglaia, I believe.
It's a hand. Thank
Okay.
you.
It's the sound of two. It's the sound of one hand clapping. Yes.
Exactly. I would switch it around though. It doesn't. I wouldn't make wisdom the thing that drives the skill of behavior. I would say it's more interactive. That living wisely drives. You know somebody has wisdom not by what they say, but by their living wisely.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So when I hear the word detectable, what I think of is, how do you know somebody is wise?
Mm-hmm.
You know somebody is wise by looking at the way they live. They enact wise behaviors. So rather than making wisdom kind of an internal trait, I would make it more how you live your life. And then you infer or detect, yeah, that person is really wise.
And I feel that that's really in line with what Qohelet is teaching us. So it's helpful that you rendered it in those terms. And the example of the lumberjack and being able to understand how to use a blade, that's where it becomes detectable, right? You can be a professor with 3 PhDs and not know how to wield an axe, depending on the nature of the blade and how much effort is supposed to be put into the dynamics of making sure that when the blade hits the wood at the right angle, that you can actually complete the task at hand, right? So I spoke of cultural incommensurability, that fancy term that I like to talk with one of my fellow meditators, Norman Fisher. We talk about this a lot. When we look at these texts, we are very far away from these nuggets and kernels and pearls of wisdom that Qohelet was speaking of. And so that puts us at a great disadvantage because we don't always understand what does it mean. How many of us around this Zoom room actually go and chop wood with an axe? Show of hands. A few of us. Okay. All right. I saw maybe 3 hands, Robin and Anne. But that's an example of cultural incommensurability. In one generation, we may not know what it means to actually chop wood with an axe, but there is a skillful means that emerges, as Erwin said, that's detectable by the way that you live your life, by the way that you accomplish a certain chore with a sense of dignity and perseverance that reflects a wider application of chokhmah that is detectable, right, as we notice together. But you're right, it is about wise living that is meant to be part of this process of Qohelet. So let me turn to Aglaia. Am I pronouncing your name right?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. You might have already said something about this, so I'm really sorry if I'm just like being repetitive and everything, though. But I put in the chat that about Psalm 92, and the verse I wanted to get a brutish man cannot know, a fool cannot understand this. Though the wicked sprout like grass, though all evildoers blossom, it is only that they may be destroyed forever. But this is after he's talking about the the handiwork, the great handiwork that God does. So I'm kind of wondering if there's some sort of connection between also knowing that this kind of, I guess, wisdom, also knowing that there is something more to it. So the person who is a wicked person is not necessarily prospering. They are going to be destroyed forever in some way. There's something more to it. Like, I don't know what it could be though, but like it's the brutish man who doesn't get it. It's the wise man who can understand that. So just throwing that out there.
It's a very interesting comparison to start looking at the portraits of wisdom within the Psalms as opposed to Qohelet or Proverbs. And I think they're different kind of degrees of wisdom cultivation. And obviously the psalmist has a very different kind of relationship with God than Qohelet does. So it's an interesting comparison because they are wisdom texts, but I think it's very important to appreciate that the only name of God that Qohelet is willing to proffer in the relationship is one that is Elohim. And if you look at the number of intimate usages of language to describe the psalmist's relationship to God, it's very different. So that psalm that you're referring to speaks of the sense of the creative design, the masterful design of the universe by God as the creator in a way that's much more intimate, perhaps, than Qohelet is willing to allow for. And also remember, in terms of the ascribed authorship, this is an interesting thing to think about too. Requires more reflection. But what's the difference in terms of the way that King David sees the world in relationship to God's place within that handiwork? And what is the relationship then that his son, Solomon, sees following in the footsteps and perhaps building on, standing on the shoulders of the giant that was his father, but also moving in a direction that was very different than his father and seeing God and God's handiwork in a very, very different way than his father did. And I think that's something that, going back to what Erwin,
that's a can of worms. That's awesome.
It is an awesome can of worms, but it's as Erwin said, I think it's really important for us, and I think Bev brought this up a couple of times in terms of indigenous wisdom, thinking about what wisdom is detectable for all of us in our own lives from our ancestors, right? Thinking about your relationship to your parents and to your grandparents, and just like even noticing the way that they would chop wood as opposed to the way that we would chop wood, or they would make gefilte fish the way that, as opposed to the way we make it, or whatever. Put in the analogy of whatever it is that you're doing that your ancestors did, and is the wisdom that you apply to that specific task detectable and discernible in the same way that it was the way that your ancestors were doing it? Or is there a distinction between what David was able to do and what Solomon was able to do, right? That David was the warrior poet par excellence, who had blood in his hands, but wrote the most beautiful love poetry or wisdom poetry in the 150 Psalms, but he couldn't build the temple of peace that his son was able to build. He didn't have the wisdom that was detectable in the generation and the life experience of David was profoundly different than the wisdom of experience that Solomon had. And maybe sometimes that's part of the purpose of being able to bring a discerning lens to the wisdom that is detectable both within our lifetime as well as what we learn from our ancestors, what we carry forward, and what we also allow to recede into the background. So it is a can of worms. It's a delightful can of worms that we're not going to be able to fully unpack together. Marty Cohen has already done another wonderful translation and commentary on Psalms, which engages that our strength and our haven, which is something that you can take a look at as well to delve into deeper. So let's take maybe
Love it.
Alex, how are we doing with time, Alex?
We're a little bit over time.
We are.
Yeah, in just
Okay.
a couple minutes. So, and
All right,
unfortunately, I think we'll have to wrap up.
Okay, so should we take one last question and then we'll close from here, or are we out of time?
If it's a quick question, we can.
Okay, let's take it one quickie and then we'll say fare thee well for now.
I just wanted to say I actually feel very uplifted with this last one. And to me, it says practice, practice, practice. And it's discerning what the practice is to bring us closer spiritually to earth, the divine, whatever. And I appreciate you using the word discernment. And I just wanted to add, the last couple of weeks I've been talking to my brother and sister, and we're in the 70s, 80s, and 90s in our age, but we're children, about my grandfather, who we called the gentle giant. And what I was talking to them about, it wasn't what he did, it wasn't how he acted, it was his presence, and that we should be learning from him.
Well, those are wonderful reflections for us to close on, and that we should all be inspired on our discerning journeys towards the application of Chokhmah that may be detectable in our lives as well as in the lives of others that we hope to inspire, and to bring more of that goodness and that unearned gift that is already waiting for us to enjoy. And I hope that you will remain curious about Qohelet. And Alex has put into the chat generously on Panui's behalf a discount code for those that are interested to get a copy of Merest Breath and to continue the curious conversations together. So thank you, everyone, for all of your engagement and your presence today. It's been a real blessing. Thanks again.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Glazer, for joining us, and thank you all for being here as well. We have a lot of great events coming up next week, especially on Monday. If you're in the Phoenix area, we've got an in-person event at our office, The Ethics of Rescue, True Stories Behind Bergen-Belson's Liberation. And if you're not in the Phoenix area, there's a virtual option as well. So hope you can all tune into that, and have a great rest of your day.